Pessoal, boa tarde. Hoje nós estamos aqui com a professora Natalie Van Deusen, da University of Alberta. Ela é especialista em assuntos relacionados à mitologia nórdica. Ela tem pesquisas relacionadas a sagas, a algumas Edas, então, alguns dos textos, né, contidos nas Edas. Então, é bem interessante o trabalho dela. Ela apareceu algumas vezes no YouTube falando dessa relação entre os games e a mitologia nórdica. Então, vou conversar aqui um pouco sobre ela, que ela vai apresentar alguns aspectos dos trabalhos na carreira dela. Professora, Professor Natalie, welcome to my channel, The Viking World. It's a pleasure receiving you. It's a very, very nice to have a person that was analyzing some things like the games in the Norse mythology. It's a very, very nice work. So for the first question, how did you start your interest in Norse mythology in the Viking Age? How did it start in your life?
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to come and talk about the stuff that I do for my work and that I'm really passionate about. So it's great to be here. I attended a language camp when I was a kid, a Danish language camp. My background is very mixed, and it was just kind of a random decision on my part to attend this camp. But I started to get really interested in Nordic languages and literature and culture. And so when I went to do my undergraduate degree, I decided to focus a little bit more on that. And I became really, really interested in the medieval past, the Viking and medieval past in Scandinavia. And then decided to continue to work on that in graduate school from there. And yeah, it was essentially just sort of following where my interests were in the region, and then more specifically that time period, and then just continuing with it. And I was lucky enough to find a job that allowed me to continue to research in this area and teach about it too.
Oh, that's very, very interesting, your history. So you are researching about in the Department of the Linguistics in the University of Alberta. So how do you describe your research aspects of your work about the Norse mythology? How this is it's composing in your career, academic career? How this is you have this research about?
Yeah, so my research is maybe the research that I do is maybe less focused on Norse mythology and more focused on kind of broader kind of literary traditions and manuscripts, what was written down in the medieval period, and how it was, recorded and transmitted and things like that, and who owned the stories and who passed them along and things like that. I do look at religious literature more generally, and that can be both pre-Christian, but mostly Christian, because that is most of what has survived. And I have a particular interest in gender in the Viking Age and medieval Iceland. So I've written quite a bit about that, and a lot of that has, in some ways touched on pre-Christian ideals and traditions in a lot of my work, such as like on friendship between women and things like that, and just gender roles more generally. But my teaching is quite a bit focused on Norse mythology and the Viking Age. So about every other year, I teach courses on those two topics. Right now, I'm teaching the Norse mythology one, and I'll be teaching the Viking Age one after the new year. So my teaching has really focused pretty strongly on that aspect, which has made me really sort of interested as sort of a side project on the ways that Norse mythology is presented in popular culture. Obviously, there's a myriad of ways that the Viking and Norse past has been adapted and misinterpreted in a lot of different ways, in really dangerous ways. And I look at that as well. But I'm also interested in looking at the ways that, the gaming culture especially has picked up on it. And I was asked by Gameology to do some reaction videos, and they gave me some kind of clips that weren't necessarily within context. So I didn't know what I was watching and, what was going on. So I reacted to those, and that made me really want to look more closely at some of these games. So I'm sort of, in addition to my own research, sort of as a like a something to do for fun because I enjoy gaming myself. Playing through God of War, and I'll be doing God of War Ragnarok next, as a way of trying to understand a little bit better how, you know, how these video games are engaging with Norse mythology and the Viking past.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's very nice to see you comment about these aspects in the games and the relationship with the Norse mythology. So, my question is about your research in the topic of gender in the Viking Age.
Mm.
I know that we have two individuals that like men's and the women's in the Viking Age. What we can say about the participation of the women in Norse mythology societies or in the Norse Viking Age society? How this is the most important aspect about this topic to comprehend how the women are participating in the Viking Age society.
That's a really good question. And it's one that also ends up getting sort of like popular culture does sort of take a different direction, and one that does have a basis in some literature, but not as much history. So what we know about the Viking Age and the medieval Scandinavian world comes to us from, just some various sources. We don't have a lot that's written from the time itself, but what we do have, a lot of literature as well as law codes indicates that there were pretty strictly divided gender roles in the Viking Age, and that the law even indicates that there were sort of separate spheres. Men were in charge of everything essentially in the public domain, and women everything in the private domain. So at the home, there was like an expression within the threshold and outside of the threshold. So it seems like women, were predominantly in charge of, domestic tasks and things relating to the home. They weren't able to, attend assemblies and participate in legal matters, except in some cases when they were like widows and they were elderly, when they were older, and they could do inheritance matters. But otherwise, it was fairly strictly divided. And contrary to sort of what pop culture does present, it was not legal for women to bear arms. It was legally only free men could bear arms. And there is this depiction of shield maidens and women and who, like Lagertha and other figures that kind of perpetuate this image, and that has sort of a basis in what was essentially their equivalent of fantasy literature at the time. So these like legendary sagas that also have dragons and gods coming in and out and people that shapeshift. And so they exist more in kind of like a more fantasy realm. So we do have them in the literature, but it doesn't really align with what we know from much of the more historical documents. And of course, we have here and there an example of a woman who, takes up a weapon in the more historical literature, but usually, and this is what Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir has mentioned, they more or less botch the job. They don't do a good job when they try to, take up arms. They don't do well. So it doesn't. And also we have, of course, these archaeological finds like the Birka find. But I think the general consensus now is that any such instance where a woman did actually participate in warfare would have been an exception to the rule. But women did also have important roles to play, as far as we can tell, in kind of the honor-based culture of the Viking Age, in using their words to compel the men in their lives to, avenge dishonors or slayings or things like that.
Oh, that's a lot interesting, because
Yeah.
when we saw that a woman having many perspectives in the Viking Age society, and we saw that a difference of perspective of a woman like a hero, and sometimes she's a very super shield maiden, and in some series or some games that they representative woman, but she have a lot of works that was describing her in the society, like a woman that stay in the house, made the, some works for the family, some works in the we have some examples relationship with the woman that was in funerals with some weapons that in the graves of women
Mhm.
with arms that describe women's warriors or shield maidens. And for this, how did you see that the comprehension of the women in the battle describes in the battles, or in the women described in the works in the daily life of the women? That was a contradiction, or it was a perspective in our society that women are these two types of a woman that work in home, a woman that go to the battle with this apart together, or this is only a thing that was present in the Norse mythology?
So whether, just making sure I understand, so whether you see both these types of women, the more domestic and the
Yes,
warrior woman in the mythology only, or in other sources, or
is in the real life
okay.
this existence, this woman present in the battle and in the like
Mhm.
a house worker.
I
Uh,
understand. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, the grave finds, like the Birka find, and some of these other ones where women are buried with weapons, do raise that possibility now. And there's some of these DNA analysis that have identified skeletal remains as being biologically female, have raised that question of, did women actually, bear arms in the battlefield? And it seems that that was likely not something that happened, with, like, that was not a common thing to happen. If there could be a lot of other explanations, and I know Judith Jesch, who wrote Women in the Viking Age, had a long response to this, to the find in Sweden, about, other things that might explain why a woman was buried with weapons. Could indicate status, or something like that, or relationship with her husband. There are some other things as well. So I think that, researchers are sort of cautious to jump to conclusions about, this meaning that women did indeed fight. And that certainly, like, from a modern perspective, I think we want to look back and say that, like, yeah, in the Viking Age, there was this, like, gender equality in a way that we don't see anywhere else. And we had these empowered women. But probably, even if that was the case, it was probably not very common. We have other sources that are, like, from outside of Scandinavia, and also ones that are more, kind of, just kind of annals and records, that they tell us things like the women and children were sent to, a safe place while the men fought. There are other things that sort of indicate that, like, it seems to sort of been the domain of men to fight and to bear weapons. So it's certainly possible, that women did, just like we see them doing in the mythology and legends, kind of in that more fantasy-like sphere. But it's probably not, it would probably be an exception to the rule.
Well, that's very interesting because we can saw that many aspects that say that women probably go to battle or probably not,
Mhm.
but we are dividing in some opinions because have persons that believe that women go to battle or women don't go and only participation in the house uh, have his only participation in house activities
Mhm.
with cooking or like costure or many things. And when we saw the expressions of these women in series like Vikings, um, or the participation women in battle in some TV series or some games, it's very, very interesting to saw that this martiality with the woman. And we can say that some aspects in Norse mythology, example, the goddess Freya was very representative with a fight woman, a
Mhm.
woman that was very violent, and she's have a very powerful. We can say that these and this is a part of tradition in Viking Age, or only an expression for the games just
Hmm.
addicted to the personality of Freya? Or Freya is this goddess, very very better woman, or she's
Hmm.
more power with magic, is more relationship with other things?
Hmm. Yeah, and she has this relationship to, she's sort of a counterpart to Odin in some ways as well, in that she takes half of the chosen slain, the Einherjar. She takes them to her hall, half of them to her hall in Folkvanger, where Odin takes the other half to Valhalla. And, you know, she's sort of in charge of the Valkyries too. And the Valkyries do represent almost warrior women. And there's some of this related literature. So there's poetry that comes after the mythological poems and the poetic Edda that has to do with like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, and he and some other heroic figures. And a few of them have these interactions with human, like Valkyries, who are like, they're human women who kind of choose the Valkyrie lifestyle for a little while, and they are taking on armor and they're fighting. And That's a really interesting thing to see. But again, it exists kind of in a more like a type of literature that is not, you know, grounded in like a real, like a familiar social reality. It's sort of a long ago, far away time. We also have in the mythology, we also have Skadi, the who marries Njord. She takes up armor, and in order to avenge her father before she gets her compensation from the Aesir. So there are some interesting examples within the mythology that, like Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir, I'll point to her again. She's talked about this kind of imaginary space where people can sort of imagine, these otherwise very strictly defined gender roles, like being, kind of, I guess, playing with them a little bit, or crossing certain boundaries and transgressing boundaries. And by the same token, we also have like a lot of masculine figures sort of, crossing over into the realm of femininity in either humorous ways, like Thor, when he dresses up as a bride and he dresses up as Freya, or whether it's Odin, who engages in some activities that are like mostly associated with women, like when he practices certain types of magic. So we have it kind of going both ways, which is interesting in the mythology.
No, that's a very very good point, because we saw that this representative, or with the representative with the Freya with the armor, in when we saw the God of War Ragnarok,
Mm-hmm.
it's with this using her weapons, and a woman that was this type of warrior stereotype within that, um, how can I say, in that personality, different of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, that Freya was more content woman, not much more
Mm-hmm.
appearing like a warrior. Is much more, she appearing like a, how can I say, a woman with very good dress, very
Mm-hmm.
very clean, not much more like a warrior in sufferment, like in God of War Ragnarok. She
Right.
with more great
Yeah.
experience. It's a very contrast, because of that I question you about that, because I was very in doubt if Freya was this woman warrior, or she's much more a woman, normal woman, that was,
Mm-hmm.
um how can I say, giving his advice, is more a council woman, that appear much more, um, making she giving much more conscious relationship with the folk Vangir.
Mm-hmm.
She's much more a woman that command folk Vangir much more with intelligence, that compared to with
Mm-hmm.
a woman that using weapons.
Yeah, no, and that's the interesting thing about Freya as well, is that even in the mythology, she's both this like goddess of war in a way, but she also is a goddess of love and fertility. And so she has like these contrasting aspects to her in a way, even in the mythology. And I know that God of War does kind of go with the idea that Freya and Frigg are the same. Then there's that sort of a long-standing argument among scholars about whether they're actually different names for the same goddess, and there's no real sort of consensus. There are some myths where both of them show up independently, but there's a lot of overlap between them. And I know that God of War does take the, you know, Frigg and Freya are the same name for the same, or the different names for the same person. But yeah, even Freya herself does contain sort of both of these aspects of womanhood, both a more traditional kind of relationship to fertility, and you know, if she has that overlap with Frigg, then there's also childbirth, but at the same time, kind of that association with warfare and the battles, or where the chosen slain go after they die, and with their association with the Valkyries.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. And we can describe that Odin, they sometimes appear like All Father or the like a supreme god of the Norse mythology, that he commands the Asgard and all gods. Sometimes that figure that's caused some mysteries about his figure, because we have the same answers for questions about him, but he's I think it's a personality that was very difficult to describe, because sometimes he appear like a person that have difficult choice
Mhm.
to appear in his life, that to take one eye to give some knowledge, or to have to choose how decisions to control the death and don't make the prophecy of the vulva
Mhm.
not be real for him. And how you can say about the figure of Odin in the Norse mythology compared to the like these describes for the medias, like in the video games, like we saw
Mhm.
an Odin more, sometimes more fragile, more thinking like he's a good guy sometimes, but
Mhm.
he's don't show up his or your real personality. But how you can say this or about this god? He is and Freya have this relationship, difficult relationship, or Odin is the guy that only think in her himself.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, within the mythology, Odin's really, I mean, he's such a complex figure. And there was a scholar, that John Lindau, who said that in order to understand mythology, Norse mythology, you have to understand Odin, and vice versa. Like you can't look at one without looking at the other. And Odin, he has this association with knowledge, and this kind of obsessive quest for knowledge and wisdom that you see throughout the mythology. And he goes to these great lengths and putting himself in danger in a lot of senses, you know, risking his head in like a riddle battle, or a battle of words or of some kind, or, you know, putting himself to the flames or hanging on the world tree in order to gain wisdom, to obtain wisdom. And he also um, has a gift of prophecy, and he has this art of called Sather, which is this kind of prophetic ritual that he evidently learned from Freya. But he knows everything that's going to happen, and you get the sense of how heavily that weighs on him to know what's going to happen, like to his son, that is going to cause, you know, the end of the world and all of that too. Um, he's also a figure who, you know, he is portrayed as really, like, by his followers outside of the mythology, as not particularly reliable. He's someone that a lot of warriors will talk about, that he's a god that they can't trust. You know, he'll give his favor to his chosen followers, but he'll withdraw it sometimes seemingly without reason. So he's not someone who is particularly trustworthy. And in some ways, he has a lot of overlap with Loki and his sort of trickster nature. I haven't seen enough of him, I think, in the God of War video games so far, and I haven't gotten to Ragnarok to really comment. But they're I know that they're doing something with the Odin Freya relationship, making the Frey, they're married because Freya is Frigg in that universe. I do think that Kratos ends up taking a lot of sort of interesting Odinic characteristics in some ways. He's sort of he's sort of enigmatic in a way, and he knows a lot but says little. Odin is often, traveling all around, and he's always going in disguise. He's never using his name. He's always going by a different name. So I haven't seen quite enough, I think, to be able to say, how accurate the portrayal is in the game. But yeah, Odin's a fascinating character, and I think he's one that I think it always surprises people when they're learning about Norse mythology for the first time, how kind of a bizarre head god he is. Because he also transgresses certain gender boundaries too through his participation in certain magic rituals. And he's a complicated figure.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to understand sometimes some aspects of Odin, because he have a lot of characters that make him how can I say, much difficult sometimes to comprehend how the intentions in the descriptions of the, or like in the documents, like in Eddas and in the sagas, that was a very, sometimes have some points that we don't know how this is only that wording, how is how he can say that, or he just wanted to say the thing. We don't know how sometimes how what his intentions, but
Exactly.
it's, yes, it's very interesting because how we can define that the point that Ragnarok will start. We can say that the fact of the death of Baldur, or the fact of the Loki have sons with Angbordr, it will be starts the Ragnarok. How
Yeah, that's a good
think it will
question.
be more decisive before the start of Ragnarok? This is so difficult to.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there's this, they say, like, I think Snorri says in the Prose Edda that, he has these, with Angrboda, he has these three monstrous children, Fenrir, he has the Midgard serpent and Hel, and that they're destined to cause death and destruction for the gods. But I would say probably the death of Balder is, and I think that the children he has with Angrboda, they play a role in Ragnarok and in bringing the gods' kind of downfall and the destruction of the gods. But the real kind of catalyst event is the death of Balder, and that's sort of that key point at which, once that happens, and then once Hel refuses to send him back because not everyone in the world would weep for Balder, then Ragnarok comes. But I don't think Ragnarok also would not have taken place in the same way without those three children, because they tried to bring Balder back from Hel's realm, and it was Hel, Loki's child, by one of his children, by Angrboda, who prevented him from coming back, which of course that's when Ragnarok started. So it's really, they're sort of tangled up in one another, I think.
Yeah, I think it's one of the events that was have so many things that will occur in accord with the fall, that we sometimes we question ourselves. Oh, it's Baldur or it's Loki that will start all this, and that's very interesting, because we have now a series of Loki in that was making him very popular because of Marvel.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he appeared like a figure with many expressions inside of the series that show a Loki that was a version of Loki woman, Loki crocodile, Loki with of many.
Mm-hmm.
And how we can say about Loki in the Norse mythology? Loki was
Mm-hmm.
giant, as was a god. What is his own true personality? Or he was
Mm-hmm.
many things in Norse mythology.
He was, yeah, I think many things is right, but I mean, I haven't seen the most recent season of Loki, but I did like that they are doing things with gender related to Loki because Loki's fascinating when it comes to gender. You know, I talked about strictly divided gender roles in the Viking Age. There was also a very clear gender hierarchy, and for men were expected to be men, and doing anything less than that standard would kind of open them up for all kinds of insults and accusations of unmanliness, which meant in turn cowardice and inability to take care of their family and all of these things. So we usually have, men behaving strictly, by prescribed gender roles, but Loki doesn't. And he shapeshifts into the form of a female horse and gets pregnant and gives birth to Odin's eight-legged horse, Sleipnir. So he actually takes on, the nature of like the physical biological nature of a woman in horse form. But we also have him shape shifting into female form a few other times, happily dressing up as Thor's bridesmaid when Thor is very reluctantly having to dress up as Freya. So he seems to have no like qualms about putting himself in a position that would, open himself up for being insulted. Which is one really interesting thing. Like he has this fluidity about gender. And also, he also is really, he has this, and I think that it's sort of allowed to happen because he isn't fully part of the gods, but he is with them. So he has this sort of like liminal status where he's kind of with them, but not really. He's with the giants at the beginning, but then he's with the gods through a lot of the main action, but then he sides with the giants again at the very end. So he's kind of an in-between figure, and he's allowed to kind of transgress a lot of boundaries, I think, in interesting ways. So I always like seeing what pop culture does with that, like what the Loki series did. There was also a Norwegian show called Ragnarok. It's on Netflix, and they do some interesting stuff with it's about some teenagers who live in Norway, and
Yes.
they figure out their gods.
Mhm.
And I really like what they do with kind of the whole kind of gender fluidity with Loki in that. So, but he is such an interesting figure, and there's no real consensus on what exactly it is that he represents. I mean, I think one of the more recent theories is that it's just generally chaos. He's an element of chaos. Yeah, I'm not sure, but he's certainly really fascinating in many, many ways. And I think he's really fascinating when talking about things like gender, because he does, like I said, transgress these boundaries in a way that like not any other people and other figures are not really allowed to do without consequence.
Yeah. Another thing that was very interesting about this series and the all this is in the mind of the character of Magni that represents
Mm.
Thor.
Oh yeah.
It is very, very interesting how the perspective that they give the characters all characteristics of some points of Norse mythology, and Loki was have a good representative in that because we saw a Loki that a man that have a gender that prefer another man's, and he have this appearance like much more sometimes with feminine characteristics with the masculine characteristics that was a mix in that character that give him a fluid gender, I think, in the series. And this is very, very, very interesting. And the representative with the young guard is one of the most curious things that I saw in our century because young guard it have some appearance that for me it was very curious. I saw in God of War a thing that I was saying that it was Not sure if I saw Jormungand it's appear like that, but when I saw in Ragnarok in the series, I think, oh my god, it's not that I want to show because he is a worm, and
Hmm.
I was in a very doubt with the appearance of Jormungand. What
Hmm.
is the description? The real description of the serpent? It's a serpent. It's a worm. What is it's Jormungand? It's a drum. What is the appearance
Yeah.
of
So
this snake?
like, and I know that this is something I got a lot of grief for because I was initially kind of surprised when I saw like how massive they portrayed him on the game. But I mean, of course, as many people pointed out, of course he's going to be that big. He encircles the world. But um, I think like we don't have a lot of visual depictions of him, and he is almost like I've always sort of envisioned him as this very, very long, but somehow very slender serpent, and that encircles the world, such that like Thor is able to fish for him using an ox head as bait. So he does that in a couple, or a myth that's told both in Snorri's Edda as well as the Poetic Edda. He uses an ox head as bait for the Midgard serpent. And so I kind of have always sort of envisioned his size relative to that. And which is why I think maybe seeing him quite that massive was somehow surprising. Like, obviously, I always thought he was long enough to go over the whole world because he kind of encircled the entire world and bites onto his own tail. But a lot more, I think, serpentine. And there's also some runic inscriptions and kind of picture stones that show that scene, that really famous Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent scene. And a lot of the rune stones that sort of have Jormungandr on them are, he's very long and slender. It's not sort of this massive beast in the same way. So that's kind of, I think, where I got that idea in my head that like, and why it was somehow surprising for me when I saw how big he was in relation to Kratos and Atreus when they meet him. So, I mean, obviously he's giant enough to encircle the world, but if you think about, I just can't get that idea out of my head that Thor fished for him with an ox head, and I can't imagine an ox head being very, very good bait for a giant whose head is of the size that it was in God of War. I don't know. That was just sort of what was in my head, I guess.
Yeah, it was a very interesting thing because it's a creature that was I think was very difficult to put in a real world. How can I
Hmm.
say, in a imaginative to
Hmm.
create for real world, because Fanny was a wolf. It was, I think, more easy to
Exactly.
transcript, and Hela not have an appearance that we can sometimes change for a woman that have one side
Exactly.
in bones and flesh appearing, and a woman, normal woman, in the other side. And Yomungad was, I think, is a creature that we have sometimes this type of description, like I think a long creature that was a serpent, but
Hmm.
in example in the series they described that was a worm that was born from Loki, and
Yes.
the fishing of Thor occur in the scene that Magni was in the middle of the fjord, and they
Okay.
represent the scene of the fishing of Yomgard,
Yes, of course. Yeah. So
and that's
they combined the myth of Sleipnir with the Midgard serpent in
yes,
Ragnarok. So he gives birth to Jormungandr, which is
yeah,
the
and
Midgard tapeworm, as like my friend called it. But yeah, they have an interesting take on that.
yeah, it's a of course it's a creative thing with the
Yes.
directors and the
Yeah.
producers, but it was a very very interesting point because it's a creature that we don't have some definitions for him. It was a serpent, but what type of serpent? What
Right.
type? It's what is your real proportion? So what is his highest, his lowest? What is this your some of his characteristics described in the Eddas, in the some in some sagas or in some Eddas that describe this creature. And my next question is about how these documents can be worked for to describe some events in the Norse mythology for these biggest productions in our world. How this is possible to use in the real characters of the documents for the this specific of these productions specifically.
Yeah.
It was a thing that was difficult to do, or it's more easy to combine some these events.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think that, like, and something I've talked to my students about before is I think that there's something about the Viking past in Norse mythology that lends itself well to adaptation, because what we have available to us is really just a small fraction of what was once out there. And it's sort of the sad reality of a lot of, literature from over, from just, under 1,000 years ago, where most of it just simply didn't survive for whatever reason. And so what's come down to us only gives us little kind of snapshots of a larger picture. And so there's that, combined with the fact that even the stories that we have were composed 200 to 300 years after the events that they're describing, and after Christianity had been adopted. And so the fact that we have only little fragments here and there, and that we're looking at it through like this filter of, people who recorded it were not the people who were practicing these religions. They were Christian scribes from a later period who were writing down things that had come down orally. I think that makes it both tricky to look at the past and at this material, but because there is this issue of like, is what we're looking at actually representative of what people believed? It leaves a lot of things open for interpretation. And there's a lot of gaps to be filled in, which I think makes the material lend itself really well to creative adaptation in this way. So you can, kind of play with it in some ways. Like, are Frigg and Freya the same person? Maybe not. We don't really know, but we're going to take that interpretation and kind of work with it. And, what might that have looked like? And so I think that there's some of the gaps in what we know, and some of the questions that the sources leave us with are also what makes this like really good material for, games and film and TV to work with in creative ways.
Yeah, and how you say about the representative of the words of Norse mythology in the actual media? So how we can say about Valheim, Helheim? They are similar what it was described, or they put some things that was different, or Asgard is not much like that, or Valhalla is a little different from that. What your perspective about the words representative in some medias?
Yeah, so the thing is, of a lot of the realms, we don't have much of anything that tells us what they looked like. We do have some information on, like, from certain sources on like what Valhalla looked like and maybe Asgard. But in terms of some of the other realms, it's not very clear. And so again, that leaves a lot of room for interpretation and being able to sort of imagine what those spaces might have looked like. The sources are so scarce in what they do tell us. So which I think that again kind of makes it really useful, like makes it really good material for like people working in, creative production to draw from, because there's a lot of questions and not much that actually tells us. You can imagine what this would have looked like. So you might have some depictions of Valhalla and descriptions of, what this looked like and what activities went on in Valhalla. But even that's fairly, like, it's fairly remarkable to have that kind of detail. about the spaces themselves.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we don't have so much descriptions about words like Muspelheim,
Mm-hmm.
Vanaheim, Helheim, many of them. And it's interesting because sometimes they are chosen for characteristics, example based in some elements like water, like fire,
Mm-hmm.
like elements of nature. And
Absolutely.
it's interesting this choose because we know that sometimes Muspelheim it's described like the land of many of fire, many
Mm-hmm.
so hot, and sometimes how high it is described like so cold. Sometimes have
Mm-hmm.
a winter that similar to Niflheim,
Niflheim,
and
yeah.
that was this cold place, and it's very very interesting how we can create that for describing, but we don't see much of them describing in the documents like almost behind like that or
Exactly.
this. And that's interesting how we can go through these directions for doing the actual productions. And
Mm-hmm.
for me it's a lot interesting. And how you describe that the elves, the creatures like,
Mm-hmm.
and how can I say, the creatures like the animals and many things like the Yggdrasil, or sometimes the other creatures that make part of the Norse mythology are represent. They are similar, or
Mm-hmm.
they are have some many difference from the descriptions of the like the light elves with the black elves. All
Mm-hmm.
this is was a thing that was in a good direction, or they are in a totally completely different direction of that was described in the document.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's a really good question. And I think it's the same kind of thing that like we just don't have a lot of depictions of them. And there have been a lot of questions about like the fact that there are light elves and are dark elves the same as dwarves, and what are the connotations of them? And that like there's been questions about how this relates to like fertility and all of these matters. But there's again, like it's only, I think, like maybe like a couple of different sources that actually mention the fact that there are dark and light elves, and they don't really say much more about that other than there are these elves and they inhabit these realms. And there was kind of some thinking, does this mean good versus evil? But again, it's not clear, and there's not enough sources to really tell us what that actually means. I do like that. I mean, I know that God of War, that they use kind of that differentiation between dark and light elves within their own mythology of the game, and also different creatures within the world tree, like some of the stags that inhabit Yggdrasil, are used, or kind of they show up throughout the game, which is really, really cool. Other, creatures that sometimes there have been like theories that dark elves and dwarves are the same. That's not the direction that God of War takes. Dwarves are portrayed very much like the smiths, and that they are within, and the ones who kind of make choice weapons and tools for the gods. So that's very consistent with what you see in the mythology and their main job. And they're also like a race of creatures who are there to both help and hinder the gods, and that's what they do kind of throughout the mythology. So I think like they do a good job of kind of showing the different kind of races that inhabit, because that's what they essentially are. They're creatures, but they're also like in some ways, maybe not races, but more tribes, that coexisted. For example, the Jötnar, it's translated to giants, but it's not giant in the sense that we think of the word giant. They're just another group of beings, kind of a competing tribe with the gods.
Oh, that's very interesting. The
Mm-hmm.
Jotnar is not only a group of giants. It's a a group that was in search term that you say that they are not, how can I say, described for the word is not described for giant. It
Mhm.
was um, people that was in fight with the gods.
Yeah, it's another sort of like they could think of them more as sort of like competing tribes that are existing together, and that there's sometimes intermarriage and procreation that happens between them. But and there's obviously a hierarchy as well. The gods are hierarchically above the Jötnar in the mythology. But yeah, it often gets translated to giants, which kind of gives the sense of them being like massive, in terms of stature, which doesn't necessarily seem to have been the case. It just seems that they're kind of another group who inhabits this realm of Norse mythology and is sort of at odds with the Aesir and the Vanir.
That's very, very interesting.
Mhm.
I have no idea about that. When they say
Yeah.
that, I would think that the Jotnar was the giants in my conception, but
Mhm.
the word is not specifically say that they are the giants. So
Yeah.
that's very, very
Yeah. So
interesting.
there's not really a better word that's been used to translate Jötnar, but that using the word giant really kind of gives off that gives off a very distinct type of image that yeah, and I haven't met enough Jötnar yet in the game to really know how accurately, based on the mythology they're presented. I mean, Loki is one of them, so I guess I have, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting point. And when we saw the episode of the Trimsgivda that Thor was in a bride and
Mhm.
Loki was he the maid
The
his
bridesmaid,
company
yeah.
maid,
Yep.
bridesmaid, uh, and that's a very interesting because we can say that this episode define that they are using some in some aspect we can describe that they are in a trying to be in another gender to assume
Hmm.
that they are just in for masquerade that they are men's they using the female
Hmm.
gender for disfarce like Thor is be Freya and in that we can say that Loki was use another gender for that, or Loki is a person that was using the same thing like Thor, just as
Hmm.
far as how we can say, because sometimes some researchers say that the episode can be a gender question
Hmm.
because of this change of the clothes or change of the the transition from man to a woman. How
Hmm.
this is really this episode can say for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story, and it's certainly one that's really memorable, and it lived on like in Norwegian folklore and like folk tales and throughout Scandinavia well beyond the Middle Ages. So it was a story that was, I think is very well known, um, and certainly one of the more memorable ones. There's some ideas about it. I think, you have that contrast between Thor, who very reluctantly dresses up as Freya, and it's almost like laughable because it's almost sort of like a little Red Riding Hood, like you're like, oh, what big eyes you have, that type of thing, because his eyes are like red, and he's giant, and there's no way, and it almost is something that's meant to sort of speak to the unintelligence, or how unintelligent the Jötnar are, that they can't recognize that this is Thor in drag and not Freya. So it almost is something that's meant to be a comment on the stupidity of Thrym and the other giants, who are the other Jötnar, who are in attendance at this bridal feast. Um, and I mean, there is a contrast though between Thor very reluctantly taking this on and saying that, the Aesir are going to insult me if I dress up as a bride. And that is very telling. They're going to say, he's saying that they're going to call me this one particular name, which was a really grave insult to call a man, which insinuated that a man was less than a man. So he's very concerned. And on the other hand, you have Loki, he doesn't even have to be asked. He very happily dresses up as a bridesmaid. He just goes ahead and does it without being asked even. And he has no hesitations. So, I mean, there's some difference of opinion about how that poem might have been interpreted at the time. It either, would have been, seen as very funny for a god who was very, very popular, whose cult was very secure at the time. Or, this could have been something that was, poking fun at, from a later Christian perspective at a pre-Christian figure.
Well, that's a very, very good point, because when we saw that many aspects in Norse mythologies say about some episodes that describe to us that men's required to some female things to use in some situations in Norse mythology, like Odin used sometimes with the satyr of the magic of Freya that will teach him, and this is a different thing, because we saw men that we are using some woman clothes, and this is have a conflict sometimes with some aspects. Example, Loki say that Odin is an Eri for using, say, the magic, but sometimes he use female clothes, and he have this transition for the woman side sometimes, like for when he changed for creatures and changed for female creatures. And this is very interesting, because Loki accused Odin of a thing that in a point he sometimes can be accuse himself, because he was sometimes a female character in some points, and this is very, very interesting to saw. And how we can say about this situation of gender in Norse mythology, we can say that is it's a possibility of individuals using of the gender of that they most like, or they most prefer, or they not accepting the for the man turned into a woman. What is we can saw about this in the Norse mythology, and if women are more considered more, how can I say, more accepting in some than compared to the men, are more valuable, are more valorized with the men. The goddess are more, can I say, my God, let me remember the word. If they are more important compared to sometimes with compared to the men, if the goddess are more required in sometimes of these female characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing, because you do see, and that's something that I bring up again, Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir. She's written a couple of books, really great books on gender in the Viking Age and mythology. And she talks a lot about gender performance and Judith Butler's theory of gender performance, and how we see that working here. And you see it working both ways, but there certainly is a greater sense that it is socially taboo for men to take on the female role. And that indicates a very clear gender hierarchy and sort of the masculine, there's like this sense of hypermasculinity in the Viking Age that was, that was the ideal, and the feminine was below the masculine. And so for a man to take on feminine characteristics is going down, and for a woman to take on masculine characteristics is appropriating, what was considered to be the higher sex. of course, they could never do that permanently. It was always a temporary thing, and they had to go back to their roles in the end. You see this with the Valkyries in some of the legends. Like, they get to sort of take on, don armor and have a sword and everything, but eventually they have to give that up and get married and have babies and do the things that society tells them that women are supposed to do. But there is a sense that for that time that they do take on more masculine characteristics, it's okay, just as long as it's temporary. But when men take on feminine characteristics, they put themselves in a lot of danger for being insulted and being called unmanly, which unmanliness has connotations of cowardice and, like I said, inability to take care of a person's family. And, you have this strong sense of the male head of household that was, especially in Iceland, where they didn't have a king. That was a really, strong idea. And so that really hyper masculine ideal was I think, even further at play there. But Loki's interesting because he's like you said, he's accusing all of these, he's telling Odin that you are Ergi, or you are, that you were a sorceress on this island long ago, and I think that's, I think you're Ergi. But and all the while Loki's doing all of these things that are way more so in that realm. But there's just something about Loki where I don't know, again, if it's because he doesn't fully fit in anywhere, that he just gets to do that, and without any repercussions. He does get called a lot of things as well, but there seems to be a sense that, like, Loki's somehow an exception to a lot of these rules. And then in Loki's quarrel, he's accusing all of these people of different types of kind of like crimes of like a more sexual nature, while he meanwhile is breaking all of these rules in terms of what men are supposed to do, and what's going to what is essentially like going to open him up for insult and insults of unmanliness.
Yeah, it's a very different thing when we think about that, because we saw Loki acting with anger of a thing that is part of him too.
Mm-hmm.
Transition from a woman to a man,
Absolutely.
to things that women do and men do, but men sometimes do things that women do too. And that's a very different thing when we saw that, because we can asking ourselves if the Norse society in the Norse mythology that is part of that is don't like of these things that appear, or this transition that occur of male and female characteristics, and for two things that are considering things or things that was not approved in some societies. I made a research about that of homosexuality in the Viking Age. I discovered a lot of things interesting about the questions of the gender in the Viking Age, that sometimes appear that men have to be sometimes be the passive or active agent in the relationship, or sometimes it was permitted that you have homosexuality relationship, but you in some cases you don't can't be the agent active. You only need to be, or you won't be the agent passive, or you need to be the agent active. Sometimes appear in some duality. I saw a lot of things about that. And for my last question is about how we can say about these aspects that define in the Viking Age society in the Norse mythology, about the definition of the gender and the relationships with the the agents of the society. We can say that women have the definitively papers in the society, or the men's need to be the definitive papers, or they can be a mix of things. How
Hmm.
this is defined or not defined, just a definition that was, oh, need to be like this, only
Hmm.
like so, or no, we can say that was very plural.
I think
This
that as far as we can tell from the more historical sources, it was pretty clearly defined. And there were some exceptions, like when women were beyond childbearing age and they were widows. There's been discussion by some scholars about like gender blurring, and how women, when they're in their like state of widowhood and they kind of more, they're somewhere between male and female. So we have some of these, and they're able to do things like discuss inheritance matters and do things, and they're described with adjectives that are usually only, associated with men in the masculine form, grammatically. But for the most part, they are pretty clearly like defined, and that's even kind of encoded within the law that. And kind of what we know historically about the Viking Age, that there were fairly, rigidly divided gender roles. There was a very clear gender binary between male and female. And of course, while there may have been some transgression between those, that would have been very much kind of an exceptional thing, not something that you would have usually seen, not nearly the plurality that, we see embodied in something like Loki. Yeah.
Well, it's very, very, very nice, saw that perspective, because we can saw that we have a lot of these things that happened in the Viking Age and the Norse mythology that defined how papers of men and women will have or don't
Hmm.
have. But we saw that sometimes have some people that not be part of this social contract that
Hmm.
was made sometimes. And this is, I think, that was during the Viking Age a very, very good period to study, because we
Hmm.
saw things that is totally different sometimes from some persons of another country. Example, we saw that um, the women have different values, different sometimes ways of to define her destinies in this society. And this
Hmm.
is, it's a very, very different point of view, because sometimes in Christianity societies, the woman sometimes not can be have this much more, how can I say, she not can be stay in a lot of papers and some a lot of personalities, and she'll be more tried sometimes to not have to accept the destiny of being a mother, and be only the having babies, that you
Hmm.
say. And in the Viking Age, we have some difference in
Hmm.
the participation of the woman. She
Yeah,
have a lot of works and different things on doing this. So
absolutely.
she has sometimes a
And,
sorceress, sometimes she has a
mhm,
home worker, or sometimes she is. It's a lot of things that
mhm.
define the society.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many stories I think that aren't told as well. And that's really important to note. And especially when we're looking, these are only the stories that survived, that were written down, and it only gives us a glimpse into maybe one part of society. So there's so much that isn't necessarily recorded that that we don't know about. We don't know a lot about. You have to sort of infer from the text about, when you're sort of looking at any sort of queering of the Middle Ages and the Viking Age, when you're looking for experiences that are outside of, the social classes that are being written about. There's so much more, obviously, than what we have, that scholars are continually trying to read through the literature to sort of read between the lines and try to find information about people whose lives weren't talked about. So there's really exciting stuff that continues to go on.
Yeah, and then we can say that the creation of the goddess like Freya, like some goddess in the Norse mythology, can be perspective that men respect more the feminine figures in the real world of the Vikings. This is can be a perspective that we have goddess that we respect.
Mm-hmm.
We can respect much more the women of our society because of this goddess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you could definitely take that perspective, and there's an important role that women play, like you said, in religious life that we didn't touch on so much with like you have, and we have this recorded in the sagas as well with these priestesses, you know, and women who play a role in religious pre-Christian religious society. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Natalie, it's a big pleasure to have to you in this interview. It's I'm very fan of your work that I said, and it's a very very nice to have to talk to you and learning a lot things with your work. And this is a very nice. Do you have something that you want to compliment?
Yeah, no, this was wonderful. I love having the chance to talk about these things, and these were wonderful questions that you have. Then, yeah, if anybody has any further questions for me after this, you can, find my page at the University of Alberta, and feel free to get in touch. I'm always happy to talk through these questions that I find really fascinating. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for a really, really fun discussion.
Thank you. I just stopped the recording.
Okay. All right.